And here we go. All righty. So again, welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you. This has been a really great effort. And I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping things in addition to talking about the recording. Right now you can see that the chat function is currently disabled. We're planning on sending all of the questions for the Q&A to myself or to Jennifer Momola, who is the current co-host. So on your drop-down menu, you should see either my name or Jennifer's name, and the questions for the Q&A will send directly there. That way it mitigates any distractions during the presentation. And that way Jennifer and I can have a really good sense of what questions need to be answered and prioritized that way as the recording is going on. As I mentioned before, we collaborated with New Jersey Forest Watch to make this presentation happen. It was an awesome effort by everybody involved, and we've got almost 200 people registered for tonight. So that's a huge win for, not only you as a, as a participant for this webinar, because it's going to be a lot of information with a lot of different voices and therefore a lot of really great questions we're hoping. But also, it's really great to see this many people who are really interested in this topic. So a small bit about me. My name is Marie Claire Egbert. I'm with the John Muir Project. I actually am based in Pennsylvania, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So New Jersey is just a stone throw away, and the Pine Barrens are some of my favorite places to visit. So JMP is a national organization with Dr. Hanson being out in California. So I'll pass this a little quick tidbit about Dr. Hanson. Excuse me. He is our principal fire ecologist and director of the John Muir Project. He has a slew of credentials going through multiple publications in the scientific journals, as well as 2 books, with his newest one that just came out called Smokescreen, which is also what is part of this webinar series. And it's a great read. I would suggest everyone to give it a look through. We can drop a link for that when we send our follow-up materials. But other than that, as we know, we want to get things started pretty soon. I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Hanson and we can get going.
Thanks, MC. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that works out just fine. All right. Can everybody see my screen okay? Good. Okay. All right. Well, again, I'm Dr. Chad Hanson. I'm a forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project. And I do a lot of work these days on the importance of protecting forests for climate change mitigation as a climate solution. And of course, the adverse impacts of logging forests on the climate, on communities, on biodiversity, and in particular on wildfire behavior. So I'm going to be focusing on 2 key issues here, and I'll cover more in the Q&A, but I want to focus in my presentation on the wildfire issue and also on the climate change impacts issue. So as MC mentioned, I talk about a lot of this in a sort of a deep dive way in my new book called Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And that's available on bookshop.com as well as Amazon. It came out in May of this year. And one thing I'll mention just at the outset is that a lot of us in the scientific community who are doing research on this are basically producing scientific findings as objective scientists that are oftentimes inconvenient economically and politically for the logging industry. And many of my colleagues and I have been the target of various forms of attacks from logging interests. And I have a couple of examples of those here. One of those was an article, an investigative piece by ProPublica that investigated logging industry attacks on a colleague of mine, Dr. Beverly Law, who's one of the top forest carbon flux scientists in North America. Now, what's really important to understand is that this is a process of grasping the science on this and getting up to speed on the science. Everyone's gone through that process. Everyone's going through that process. I certainly did years and years ago as I first started looking into this. And so I say this because a lot of the truths that are emerging from the scientific evidence are seemingly counterintuitive at first. And I mention that because a lot of well-meaning people, NGOs and others, well-meaning environmental journalists, well-meaning policymakers, have been misled by a lot of the misinformation coming out of the logging industry. And it's led a lot of people, well-meaning and good people, to promote things that actually would make things worse in terms of wildfire and in terms of climate change. So I'm going to talk about two key ones tonight. I'm going to focus on them. But again, we can talk about more of these kind of additional issues in the Q&A. First one I want to talk about is the myth that we should be managing our forests and our wildland, our forested wildlands, supposedly as a home protection or community protection measure to protect them from wildfires. What I'm going to talk about here is basically the science indicating that does not work. It actually makes communities even more vulnerable to wildfire, and that there's only really one effective way to protect homes from fire, and that is to focus on the homes themselves and the immediate vicinity around the homes, basically 100 feet at most around each home. This is called, the home protection aspects is called home hardening. And basically it comes down to a few things. One is things like ember-proof vents, basically putting a fine wire mesh on those old coarse wire attic vents. And the reason that matters is that most homes that burn in wildfires do not come in direct contact with flames. Most homes that burn in wildfires burn from embers that are driven by the winds far in advance of the flames, sometimes even 2 miles in advance of the flames. And those embers can get blown through those old coarse wire mesh exterior vents and end up in someone's attic or some other interior space and cause an ignition and burn the house down. That's how most homes burn in wildfires. $200 or $300 at Home Depot or some other hardware store with some modern ember-proof vents can save many homes from fire. That's just one thing, of course. Rain gutter guards are important to keep dry leaves and needles from accumulating in the rain gutters right next to the roof, because again, the embers can land in those in that material and or land on the roof and roll down into the gutters and cause an ignition. If you have the rain gutters, it's not going to happen. Now, the other one, of course, is defensible space. We call it defensible space pruning within 100 feet of homes. And it's not about removing mature trees. You don't want to do that. You want the shade from those trees, but you do want to remove lower limbs. You want to remove small trees closest to the home and dry grasses, and keep the twigs and dry leaves and needles on the forest floor at a minimum really close to the house, especially that first 30 feet. Beyond that, you can be less intensive. And that's those two things in combination. That's what makes the difference in terms of whether a home survives a fire or not. It's not about managing forests out in wildlands. In fact, what the science is telling us is that beyond 100 feet from homes, there is no additional benefit in terms of vegetation management for protecting homes. And so your effectiveness stops at somewhere between 60 feet and 100 feet from homes. Beyond that, there's no additional benefit. Now, I'm going to give a couple of examples here of why this is so important. This is a map of showing the trajectory of the campfire in 2018. And as some of you may know, the campfire had devastating consequences for the town of Paradise. And what a lot of people don't realize, though, is that in the first 6 hours that fire burned, it burned through an area that was one of the most heavily logged areas in the entire northern Sierra Nevada. Dead trees were removed, live trees were removed under the guise of fuel reduction and thinning by the thousands and thousands. And that's the area that the fire burned through the fastest and most intensely. Now, of course, you had the hot, dry, windy conditions. Without that, the fire would not have spread very fast. But previous logging that happened in prior years was a significant exacerbating factor. And basically what it meant was, because it moved through that area so intensely and so quickly, people in the town of Paradise had very little time to evacuate. 86 people lost their lives and over 14,000 homes were burned. Now, that's the real tragedy in communities from wildland fire. It's not the effect of fire on forests. Fire creates great habitat, but it can devastate communities if we're not protecting them from wildland fire. Excuse me about that. If we're not protecting them from wildland fire, it can have a devastating effect. And so that's where our focus needs to be. And this is not just a Western issue. We saw that, of course, in 2016, as Gatlinburg, Tennessee, was parts of it were devastated by a wildland fire. So we know this is something that is both east and west. And the bottom line is this is preventable. These tragedies are preventable if we focus on communities and stop trying to think that we can stop fire by managing forest wildlands, because we can't. Same thing from a big fire in Northern California this year. This is the Caldor fire, and you can see all these orange, light and medium orange areas. That's previous thinning, basically logging under the guise of thinning, mostly on national forest lands. And you see that western side of it is a little town of Grizzly Flats. The entire perimeter, all around that, 360 degrees around that town, there was intensive thinning across thousands of acres. And that's what the fire burned through the most rapidly and most intensely. And now the town of Grizzly Flats is mostly gone. And that, again, was preventable. So why does this happen? People have the assumption many times that if you remove trees from the forest, that somehow you are reducing fuels, or you're reducing the density of the forest, and that'll curb fires. It'll make them burn less intensely, or it'll be more difficult for them to spread. The science is telling us something very, very different. And what it's telling us is that denser forests with more trees, have higher canopy cover. And this is true whether it's a pine forest or whether it's a deciduous forest. It's true whether it's the Western US or Eastern US, that denser forests have higher canopy cover. Higher canopy cover means more cooling shade of that forest canopy cover. And that means that everything on the forest floor stays more moist in a denser forest and more shaded. And therefore, it's less conducive to fire. In addition, a denser forest has a windbreak effect against the gusts that drive the flames. Whereas when logging occurs, including what is sort of euphemistically called thinning, that actually reduces that windbreak effect and allows the fires to spread faster and more intensely through these forest stands. This is just one study that's found this. It just shows you that in most cases, the areas that are thinned, where more trees are removed, the wind speed is actually higher, and there's greater potential for crown fire. This is from Cruz et al. 2008. This is another study looking at different scenarios, mostly with regard to fire weather conditions and other factors. And it just shows these are areas that had commercial thinning. And in most of the scenarios, the ones going to the right from the center line, fire intensity went up. Now, of course, fire is highly variable depending upon what a gust of wind is doing at any given moment. So, of course, some thinned areas are going to burn at low intensity, and you see that here. The fires are highly variable. But the important point is, on average, thinned areas and other logged areas are typically burning at equal or higher intensities most of the time. And again, it comes down to microclimate. Thinning and other logging reduces the cooling shade of the forest canopy, creates hotter, drier, windier conditions, and it leaves behind combustible logging slash debris, and oftentimes spreads invasive combustible grasses as well. The interesting thing is, this conclusion about the effect of logging on the microclimate and on fire behavior is something we're seeing not just in the Western US at this point. We're seeing it in various places around the world, including in the eucalyptus forests of southeastern Australia. Same thing. So this is not about the particular forest type. It's not about a particular type of natural fire regime. It's not about the hemisphere. Even it's about intrinsic properties and what happens in terms of forest microclimate when you remove trees. And I'm actually a co-author of the largest scientific analysis ever done on this question in the Western US, Bradley et al. 2016. We looked at 3 decades of data, over 1,500 fires. And what we found are 2 key things. Forest fires are driven mostly by weather and climate factors, and therefore also by climate change. That's the #1 conclusion. However, forest management is a key secondary factor, but it doesn't work in the way most people think. What we found, and the data were strong on this, the results were strong, is that forests with fewer environmental protections and more logging actually burned more intensely. So in other words, the more trees that are removed from the forest, the hotter and faster fires tend to burn, oftentimes toward towns. And that is a very, very dangerous situation for communities living in areas close to wildlands where well-meaning, well-intended people are removing a lot of trees, thinking that's somehow going to curb fires. It's not doing that. It's actually having the opposite effect. And it's giving communities a false sense of security, thinking that that thinning project, that logging project out there in the forest wildlands will save them from fire, and they don't have to do their defensible space or put ember-proof vents on their house. So another myth that I want to talk about briefly is this idea that denser forests will burn more intensely because they have more fuel. That's simply not the case. Again, denser forests have more biomass, they have more carbon, which is good, but they do not burn more intensely because, again, of the microclimate effect. There are many studies that have looked at this and found the same conclusion. I've cited just a few of them here. I cite a lot more in my book, Smokescreen. But this is the bottom line. This is one of those studies, Alden Dunn, 2018. It just shows that as biomass goes up, fire intensity tends to go down. And that's that line, that squiggly line in the middle of the graph there. As biomass goes up, fire intensity generally goes down, not up. Interestingly, same thing is true with dead trees. Dead trees do not increase fire intensity. In fact, many of the studies are finding that dead trees, forests with more dead trees burn at equal or lower intensities when fires occur. And that's true even after the dead trees fall, years after they die. Now, why is that? This is just one of those graphs that, from a study, Meigs et al. 2016. How can that possibly be? Well, it comes down to moisture. Just like the microclimate effect I was explaining just a moment ago with regard to forests that are denser and have higher canopy cover, denser, more mature forests often have more dead trees and more down logs. Turns out that those down logs act more like giant sponges than as fuel. And in fact, they can have 25 times more water, those down logs, per cubic unit of area than the surrounding soil. And so they soak up and retain massive amounts of water. And that actually can have a suppressing effect on fire. Now, another one that comes up a lot is this idea that if forests haven't burned in a long time, if they burned at a certain frequency historically, and now they haven't had as much fire over the past 30 years or 50 years or 100 years, that therefore they will burn much more intensely if a fire occurs because of fuel accumulation. We hear that a lot. That's the narrative, that time since fire equates to fuel accumulation. And therefore to much higher fire intensity if a forest hasn't burned in a very long time. Now, what we're finding in study after study after study is that's just not true. Now, temporarily, previous fire will modify subsequent fire behavior, but for a very short period of time, several years, maybe 10 years, maybe even 12 to some degree, but it drops off very quickly with every year. The point is that after that, there's really no increase in potential for intense fire with each passing decade. It's basically sort of flat. If anything, it can often go down in its potential for higher fire intensity. This is one of those results. This is from Odian et al. 2010. And you can see those black bars in these graphs that's high intensity fire. And you can see the forests that haven't burned in the longest period of time, when they burn, they actually have lower levels of high intensity fire. TSF means time since fire in the x-axis there. So you can see forests that had not burned in 75 years or more prior to these wildfires, they actually burned overwhelmingly at low and moderate intensity and had even lower levels of high intensity fire. And why is that? Well, once again, it comes down to microclimate, because forests that haven't burned in a very long time tend to be denser. They tend to have higher canopy cover. And yes, they have more biomass, they have more carbon, but they have lower potential typically for wildfire, especially the higher intensity wildfire. So I'm also going to talk briefly before Q&A about the myth of logging, including thinning, for carbon storage. A lot of folks have made the assumption that if we log our forests, if we thin our forests, that will somehow reduce fuels, it'll stop fire or substantially reduce fire intensity, and that will somehow keep more carbon in the forest. Now, that's not consistent with the current science, and I'll explain why. So first thing I want to communicate is the fact that we know in order to overcome the climate crisis, we have to do not one, but two things. We have to get away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But that's not enough anymore because atmospheric CO2 levels are just way too high, and they still are going up. Once we put all that excess CO2 up there, it stays up there for a very, very long time, many decades, even centuries. So we have to draw it down, and we have to get away from all our excess carbon emissions from fossil fuel consumption and logging. But we also have to protect our forests so they can absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. So natural climate solutions are an absolute necessity to overcome the climate crisis. And in fact, protecting forests around the world can be as much as half of our needed climate change mitigation, which is incredibly important to understand. However, a number of harmful myths are getting in the way of us making progress in terms of climate solutions. Now, one of those myths is this idea that because we have suppressed fire, because many of our forests have significantly less fire now than they did historically, that means our forests are overgrown, that they have too much carbon in them. Now, the reality is that the vast majority of our forests have much less carbon in them than they had historically because of many, many decades of logging, even centuries of logging in certain areas. And so what the science is telling us is that we actually have less carbon in our forests overall in the US than their biological potential and than they had historically. And that means if we protect our forests, they have very significant climate change mitigation potential because they have great capacity to absorb a lot more CO2 from the atmosphere and incorporate that into the growing wood in the forest. Now, we cannot accomplish that though, if we keep logging our forests, including on public lands. Now, this is a photo provided by our friends at New Jersey Forest Watch. This is on New Jersey state public lands on Sparta Mountain area. And this just shows the effects and the devastation from logging. And this, of course, is not only damaging wildlife habitat, but it's also putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, taking it out of the forest and putting it into the atmosphere. And we see the same thing here. This is also the Sparta Mountain area. And again, this carbon is mostly in the atmosphere. It's not in lumber products for the most part, and I'll explain that in a minute. And by the way, this is also not going to reduce fire intensity. These areas are fires actually move more rapidly through these areas because there's more combustible vegetation that grows in after the logging, and because there's no windbreak effect and there's no cooling shade of the forest canopy. All right, so the first thing I'll mention here is when a wildfire occurs, it turns out only about 2% of the tree carbon is actually consumed, even in a really big fire. So the trees can get scorched on the outside, and even if the trees get killed, only the very outer superficial layer of the bark is consumed. Leaves can get consumed, pine needles can get consumed, the smallest twigs, and of course seedlings and very small saplings. But otherwise, the carbon is still in the forest. And it stays there for a very, very long time. And of course, the fire cycles nutrients. It creates a nutrient-rich bed of mineral ash that helps spur growth and enhance forest carbon sequestration capacity and productivity for many, many decades. And that actually it allows the forest to absorb a lot more CO2 from the atmosphere. That accelerates with every passing year after fire. And so as a result, not only do our current fire models, vastly overstate and exaggerate the amount of carbon emissions from wildfire, but none of them take into account carbon sequestration after fire from post-fire natural regrowth. And that's a major flaw. Turns out that forests recoup that carbon that's emitted very quickly, oftentimes within less than a decade after fire. And this is just one photo. This is me and Dr. James Hanson, climate scientist, in an area in the Rim Fire, a fire that I've studied a lot in the Sierra Nevada. And this is just natural post-fire regrowth, and that also equates to a lot of carbon sequestration. This is at only 7.5, almost 8 years post-fire. And you see all that rapid regrowth. This was not planted, that's all natural regeneration. But when logging occurs, such as post-fire logging, oh, by the way, this is also natural regeneration. This is an area that's far from the nearest surviving tree, and it's all natural regrowth at 8 years post-fire. But where logging occurs, and this is true in California, it's true in Southeast Australia, it's true in forests of Africa and Amazonia. It's also true in the Eastern US, that where logging occurs, you actually remove the carbon and you introduce invasive, often very combustible grasses. and damage and destroy the natural post-fire regrowth. This is an area that was post-fire logged under the guise of restoration or reforestation, and that's what it looks like years after the logging occurred. Still, it's just basically bare ground, invasive grasses and stumps. This is a loblolly pine forest in southeastern Texas. And I know there's some loblolly as well in southwestern New Jersey. And they regenerate wonderfully after high intensity fire, including after low intensity fire. So no matter whether the fire is low or moderate or high intensity, and all fires are mixed, they're mostly low and moderate intensity, but there are some patches of high intensity like this. And the forests regenerate wonderfully and sequester a lot of carbon afterwards. But again, if post-fire logging occurs, then the natural regeneration is killed by the logging equipment. Invasive combustible grasses are introduced and soil is damaged, and even the planted trees mostly die. And that's what you see here. And this is the same area in the same fire in Southeast Texas. So the lesson is that we need to keep the carbon in our forests, just like we're trying to keep the carbon in the ground right now. It's the same conversation. We need to start protecting more forests and start a process, a multi-decade process of reducing our wood consumption so we can actually overcome the climate crisis. That's going to be essential in the coming 10 and 20 years. And our forests could absorb, there's still carbon sinks overall, but they could absorb a lot more CO2 from the atmosphere if we protected them from logging, including especially on state and federal public lands in both the East and the West, and that includes the state lands in New Jersey. And one thing that really concerns me is the growing threat of biomass logging. And what I mean by that is removing trees from forest and burning trees or portions of trees for energy production, as if they're sticks of coal. It turns out that the science is telling us that burning trees or portions of trees for energy actually emits even more CO2 into the atmosphere than burning coal for equal energy produced. So in other words, in apples to apples comparison, equal energy produced, burning trees for energy is actually worse than coal for the climate. It's a climate change nightmare. It's really hard to be worse than coal, but biomass and wood pellets actually does that. So we really need to, if we care about climate change and climate solutions, we really need to push back on any efforts to expand or promote logging of forests for biomass. Now, logging in US forests emits 10 times more carbon than fire and native beetles combined. And that's nationwide. So logging is the real carbon bomb. It's not fire and it's not beetles. Again, when fires occur or if trees die during a drought or from native beetles, the carbon is still there. Logging conducted under the guise of thinning emits 3 times more carbon per acre than wildfire. So this is not a climate solution. This is not the way to go. Not only does it not protect communities, and not only does it not stop fires, it often makes them burn faster and more intensely toward towns, but it makes climate change worse. And I'm one of 200 scientists that just sent a letter to Congress talking about these points. We sent one to Congress this year, just last week, but also another one last year as well. So we have the nation's top climate scientists and ecologists telling Congress, listen, we have to protect our forests and increase protection in order to overcome the climate crisis. Now, so how does this work? Turns out when a tree is removed from the forest, most of the carbon in that tree goes into the atmosphere almost immediately. Very little ends up in a 2x4 in a house or an apartment building somewhere. And the reason for that is that a large portion of the tree is in the branches and the tree tops. And that's not usable for lumber. So that material these days is oftentimes trucked down to biomass facilities and incinerated for energy production, which again, puts all that carbon into the atmosphere. It's a climate change nightmare. Bad idea. The remaining carbon is in the log that's hauled to the lumber mill. Now, of course, it's round, it's got bark, and you've got these big, thick saw blades that are going through it. And only a certain remaining amount of that can be turned into dimensional lumber. The rest ends up as mill residue, about half of that log. And that is often incinerated burned at the lumber mills for energy production as hog fuel, another type of forest biomass energy production, which again, puts that carbon right into the atmosphere immediately. And then, of course, you've got 17% on top of that of carbon emission, additional 17% carbon emissions from all the fossil fuel consumption through transportation with the logging trucks and other machinery transporting the wood. So it ends up being that only a small, relatively small percentage of the carbon in a given tree ends up in a wood product, and it doesn't store for that long anyway in the typical house. So it's important to understand that when we're removing trees from the forest, most of that carbon is going into the atmosphere. And these figures are national. They include the East and the West, and these are composite figures. So what does it all mean? Bottom line is, be very, very wary of any legislation, state or federal, that's telling you that removing trees from forests is a climate solution or is a fire management solution. It is not. It does exactly the opposite, and support measures to protect public forests and acquire more public forests into protected public ownership in order to mitigate the climate crisis and increase access to nature and also protect biodiversity. And so for more information, of course, there's my book Smokescreen, and also a 2015 textbook that I co-authored called The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires. And so I will stop screen sharing there and would be very happy to answer questions.
All right. Thanks, Chad. That was a great presentation. We're going to start the Q&A, and just as a small clarifier, because I did get some questions about the Q&A aspect during Chad's presentation. To submit your questions, there's in the chat function, there should be a drop-down menu, and you have the option to send a message to either myself or Jennifer Momola. And we compiled all of those questions, and we're going to take turns going back and forth, asking the ones that we received. We've gotten some really, really, really great questions. I'm pretty excited. So we'll dive right in. Jen, I'll start first. I have here from Alyssa. Is the benefit of fallen logs retaining moisture equal for softwoods and hardwoods, Chad? So these are going to be questions that are coming from different sections of the presentation. I'm going to do my best to put them in a good order.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the one of the top researchers on this has done the most work as a colleague of mine. I asked him that very question. I have not done the field work on this myself. He and some of his colleagues have. And what I got from him is that it really is highly variable, but it's not. There's no clear rule like hardwoods, softwoods absorb the water and hardwoods don't. It's not like that. It can vary depending upon the region, mostly depending upon how much precipitation that region gets. And so regions that get more precipitation, the logs, regardless of hardwood or softwood, they tend to absorb a lot of water. And of course, even in the dry regions like the more desert forests in the West, they absorb a lot of water too, relative to that ecosystem, just not as much as you would in New Jersey, for example.
Great. Okay. And then I have a question here from Janet. She said, I saw a PBS show about Indigenous lives. There was a big part about planned burns and what was imperative for reducing invasive and to help wildlife. What are your thoughts on prescribed burning? And then a follow-up question, who I apologize, I did not catch their name. I don't want to scroll back through, but what do you make of controlled burns in areas in which fire has been a natural part of the ecosystem? I figured you could pair those two together.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I'm going to say two things about this I think are really key, and I'm really glad for the question. This is one of the questions I was hoping would come up in Q&A. First thing is, I think that prescribed burns can play an important role in protecting communities from wildfire in a narrow buffer around the communities, not out farther into wildlands, but another couple hundred feet. I think that can play a role, especially after the home hardening and defensible space pruning are already done, because you want to make sure that communities have that work done, the fire safe principles already done before you think about doing prescribed fire adjacent to a community. That's the first thing. I think it can play a role. Prescribed fire does not mimic natural wildfire in terms of fire from lightning strikes. It's its own thing, but I do think it can play that role. And also, of course, there's Native American cultural burning that occurred for thousands of years before colonization, and that's its own distinct aspect of burning as well. That shouldn't really be confused with wildfire from lightning strikes or prescribed burning by state or federal agencies, and they all have a unique role. They all have an important role. But I think for me, the thing that's most important is that we need to focus first and foremost on making sure that communities are given the assistance and technical information to become fire safe. That's first and foremost. And then I think we need to have a narrow buffer of prescribed fire adjacent to communities. We need to allow more mixed intensity wildfires from lightning strikes further out, and especially under safer conditions if communities are nearby, and also more Native American cultural burning. And one key thing I want to mention here is that there's a big misconception out there that if you are going to do a prescribed burn, that you have to remove trees first. That is absolutely contradicted by the scientific evidence. There are many, many different studies that have been done on this in various areas, and it really comes down to weather. If you want to do a prescribed burn and you want to achieve mostly low intensity surface fire effects, you simply do it earlier in the fire season when things are still relatively moist, but dry enough to carry flames, very short flames that will just barely creep along. It's really about the seasonality and the weather. You certainly don't want to do it in a drought year in the middle of fire season during hot, dry, windy conditions. It really is about weather and climate. And so once you understand that and realize that there's 40 years of scientific studies of people doing prescribed fires in the densest forests that haven't burned in a very long time, but doing it in the earlier part of fire season without removing a single twig from the forest. Once you realize that, that it's a fallacy to think that you have to log a forest first before you do prescribed fire. In fact, all that's going to do is just put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, and it's probably going to make the next wildfire burn more intensely anyway. So I wanted to mention that. And the last thing I'll mention on that is there's a misconception too about historical fire frequency in forests of the West and the East based on something called fire return intervals and fire scar records. And I can talk more about this in a little bit, but I just wanted to flag that there's lots of research that's come up more recently indicating that fires did not occur as frequently historically as we thought. And we need to not use those fire return interval data as a guide for how often wildfires or prescribed burns are being done. In some areas, we're seeing prescribed burns being done every 2, 3, or 5 years based on a misconception about fire return interval, when naturally those fires burned every 25 or 30 or 40 years historically.
Awesome. A quick follow-up question to that is from Catherine. She asked, is it damaging to the soils in the seed bank when accelerants for high temperature burns are used in hardwood wetland forests with thin soils?
Yeah, it can be. It can be. And this is one of the concerns about relying too much on prescribed burning, especially in certain ecosystems, and especially if you've got wetter conditions and wetter forests where land managers oftentimes and typically do use a lot of accelerant to get the flames going. And if you're using accelerant to get the flames going, you're doing something wrong in the first place, because you really can have a lot of protracted soil heating in a particular area for long periods of time that's really not reflective of the way wildfires burn. Wildfires slowly move over the forest and then they're gone in any given square meter. They don't just sit there and cook and cook and cook the way that you can have happen if you do a prescribed fire and use accelerant like that. So yeah, I am concerned about that.
Awesome, thank you. All right, we have a question here from Nicholas. It says, so why in New Jersey proposed logging forest management plan proposed by the New Jersey Audubon using fire as a pretext when absolutely no historical evidence exists in North Jersey ever existed? We in New Jersey are 5th for rainfall and maybe even 4th or 3rd for rainfall in the Northeast. Also, New Jersey forests cut down 3 times already since before the Civil War. 1% of our organic matter in the top 6 inches of soil hold approximately 27,000 gallons of water per acre. So excuse me, Nicholas, I'm sorry. I hope that I captured your question correctly. It's a little long, so I wanted to make sure I got it. But do you need me to repeat anything for you, Chad, or is that good?
No, that's a great comment. And there's a couple of things that I'll respond to. So what I think, really the comment is getting at is that, you really can't generalize things and say, and sort of assume that fire was roughly the same historically in southwestern New Jersey, in the Pinelands, as it was in northeastern New Jersey, in forests, upland forests that are more deciduous and wetter and denser. Very, very different fire regimes naturally. So there's a natural fire regime of one type or another in lots of different forest types in this country, but many of them did not burn very frequently. In fact, oftentimes, especially in the wetter forests, the wetter deciduous forests, historically, they may have burned once every several decades or longer. Whereas you may have had more frequent mixed intensity fires in forest types like the Pinelands in southwestern New Jersey. So it's really important not to generalize and just assume. Let's see. Yes, I totally agree with the comment that there's a lot less carbon in these forests because of many, many decades, even centuries of logging, removing carbon from them. And so the idea that we're going to somehow curb fire by removing trees is really just a fallacy. It's just going to, if anything, make fires burn more rapidly toward homes.
Awesome. All right. I've gotten a bunch while we've been talking. I've just gotten a bunch more questions in the chat. So I know Jen has a couple. Right. I'm going to pass it off to her to ask them, and I'm going to go through these questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for your questions. We're definitely going to try and get to all of them. If not, we'll download them and try and ping you guys personally. So we're going to stick with more of the ecology, and then we're going to switch into a policy mode. So so Sarah Thompson's curious, are all post-fire areas guaranteed for regrowth?
Great question. Here's what I can tell you. I have been studying this in the field for about 2 decades in the Western US, as well as in parts of the Southeast. I have not found any areas that do not naturally regenerate after fire. Including large high-intensity fire patches, which are not that common, but they do occur. And the cool thing is you get this wonderful heterogeneous mix of regeneration. It's not all the same in all places, which is good. Ecologically, you want that mix. Some places it's more hardwood, some places it's more conifer, some places it's a mix of conifer and shrubs, and it's very open. Conifer and hardwood and it's more open with more shrubs. It's really a mix. And what I can tell you, though, is that what I'm not finding anywhere are areas that just don't regenerate after fire, except in some areas that have had intensive post-fire logging with all that soil damage. Some of those areas really are not regenerating after the post-fire logging, but that's not because of the fire, it's because of the logging damage. I can also tell you that I've communicated with folks in New Jersey who in particular study fire ecology in the Pinelands in southwestern New Jersey. And what I'm seeing is images of abundant natural forest regrowth, particularly pines, in those areas, in both low, moderate, and high intensity fire patches. So it appears that these processes are intrinsic. This is deep evolutionary history. Bear in mind that fire in the forests of this planet goes back 350 million years of evolution. This is very, very deep evolutionary history. And our forests are strongly adapted to naturally regrow after fire. And it's not limited to one particular forest type or another. We see wonderful regeneration in forests all over the world that have a natural fire regime.
Great, thanks. Kip Cherry would like to know, can you please discuss the hazardous fuels reductions provision in the infrastructure bill with a price tag of over $14 billion? And which I believe provides logging in the national forests?
Yes. Okay. So that great question. Thank you for that. So there are logging provisions in both the infrastructure bill and the budget reconciliation bill, also known as the Build Back Better Act. I'll talk about the infrastructure bill briefly first. So in the infrastructure bill, which just passed, of course, on Friday, There is about $2 billion of new logging subsidies, mostly for additional logging on national forests and other federal public lands. There's also $400 million in subsidies for biomass and wood pellet facilities, which would affect probably mostly private lands or some mix of private and public lands in both the East and the West. Bad idea. And there's also some new rollbacks of environmental laws. There's a new categorical exclusion to eliminate meaningful environmental analysis for certain logging projects on national forest lands. So those are all bad provisions. There is additionally the $14 billion, it's actually $17 billion now, $17 billion of new logging subsidies, mostly two provisions that add up to 14 billion, and then some smaller provisions that add a little bit more to that. And that's in the reconciliation bill, which has not passed. And those provisions could be taken out or modified to prevent logging. And it would be a simple thing. All Congress needs to do, all our friends, the Democrats in Congress need to do is add language to ensure that any management that happens is non-commercial. It can't involve logging. And if they did that, then what we would have is billions of dollars for defensible space pruning for homes next to public lands to save them from fire, and reintroducing more fire into more remote forests where forests haven't had as much fire in recent decades as they did in the past. That would be great. But right now, that 14 billion in particular, plus another 3 billion in some other provisions, could be used to massively increase logging on national forest lands across the nation. And we just can't afford that. We can't afford it from a climate standpoint or a fire management standpoint.
Yeah. I really like this question. Lucas asks, other than basic letter writing to state officials, where do you think it is best for our focus our efforts?
I think, it's really important for people to communicate with state officials and also your federal, members of your congressional representative and your U.S. senators. I think it's really, really important for people to communicate at both the state and federal levels on this. And, I recommend directly communicating. Writing letters is great. Sending emails is great. You can also do it over social media. And of course, our own MC Egbert can give you tips on that. And so can Jen. And how to communicate, with elected officials at the state and federal level in these ways. I also think it's really important to take advantage of simple things that make a big difference, like letters to the editor and opinion editorial articles in local papers, and then get those published, and then take a picture and text that or email it to your member of Congress, to your state elected officials. And just basically maximize that effectiveness. Organize monthly letter writing and texting, sessions from local community members. There's lots of different ways to do this, but we really need to get involved and hold our elected officials accountable, because we know, of course, it's not just the Republicans that are not doing the right thing on forests. It's also, unfortunately, a lot of the Democrats right now. And we can see that right now in the logging provisions in the infrastructure bill and also the reconciliation bill.
Tucker wants to know, what are the best ways of restoring CO2 in both forests and our soils?
Great question. The best thing that we can do to restore carbon, increase carbon storage in our forests, including in the trees and the soils, is to stop logging them. So basically that means, protecting our state lands from logging, stopping the logging on state lands, stopping the logging on federal lands. And also, if we're going to allocate $17 billion of taxpayer subsidies to something pertaining to forests, let's not do that. Let's not allocate that for logging and removing carbon from our forests and putting it in the atmosphere. Instead, let's allocate that $17 billion for land acquisition from willing sellers to acquire a lot more forest lands in the East and the West, so we can increase habitat protection, meet our 30 by 30 goals, and also increase carbon sequestration and allow our forests to play a more significant role in terms of climate solutions.
Is there a term for what we're talking about? I think of Dr. Muma and pro-forestation versus restoration versus afforestation.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that that little softball pitch there. Appreciate it. Yes, the term for that, what I'm talking about here is proforestation. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Mumma, who's a climate scientist at Tufts University and a five-time IPCC co-author, he coined this term, he and his co-authors, in a 2019 paper. And basically what proforestation means is protecting existing forests so that they can absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere and draw down atmospheric carbon. And it turns out proforestation is vastly more efficient, vastly more effective than planting trees, than in terms of climate change mitigation. Because of course, you plant trees and it takes them a very long time to get to a size where they're really absorbing a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. Whereas protecting existing forests, you get your bang for the buck immediately, and it's a much larger bang for the buck.
So Alyssa, there are a lot of students from a GIS class are here, and they're working on wildfire management an assignment, and they're wondering if you can explain how the data was collected in the maps in the beginning of your presentation.
Great question. Yes. So in terms of the GIS data, the maps that I showed you were prepared by a colleague of mine named Bryant Baker, who's a GIS expert and a conservation biologist at an organization called Los Padres Forest Watch. And either Jen or MC could certainly get you his information. He loves to talk about GIS analysis, especially with regard to past forest management and wildland fire. And Bryant Baker is done some wonderful work on this. And basically what he's done is he's taken GIS layers from the state and federal government on past forest management in terms of the type of logging, the year it occurred, the boundaries of it, and then merged that with the boundaries of recent fires and fire history. And you get this really, really compelling image that emerges. And what it's telling us is that even in these areas where vast portions of the landscape have been heavily managed, ostensibly, to curb fire, mostly through commercial thinning, what you're seeing is the fires are just rapidly sweeping through those areas. You can see this here, and this is this is one of the maps that my friend and colleague Bryant Baker created. This is of the Dixie Fire. Fire almost 1 million acres that occurred earlier this year in the northern Sierra Nevada. And what you can see is those yellow and orange areas are huge areas of mostly commercial thinning that was conducted ostensibly as fuel breaks and to stop fire or curb fire. And in fact, what we saw is the fires burned rapidly through those areas, burned down the town of Greenville. It's a town I know well. Greenville is basically gone now because the fire burned so rapidly through all those so-called thinned areas. It burned to the west of this lake that you can see in the middle there called Lake Almanor through many, many thousands of acres that had been intensively thinned on both public and private lands. And in fact, that was the day that it spread the fastest and most rapidly. It made a big northward run. I believe it was something more than 12 miles in that day. And that was almost entirely through those heavily thinned forests. So point is, you get a drought year, you get the hot, dry, windy conditions, fires are going to spread more. But on top of that, this logging history, including thinning, is typically acting as an exacerbating factor. And when it does that, it's oftentimes affecting towns because the fires are burning through these thinned areas that are being done around towns, and they're burning more rapidly through them and with tragic consequences.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jen. I just did a rapid fire response as much as I could to everybody in the chat. Again, keep sending your questions because this is awesome. And we're going to try to, compile all the questions from the chat. And then in our follow-up materials, any questions that we don't get to in the webinar, in the recording, we will do our best to do a response to in our follow-up materials. So please, please, please keep sending questions. We've gotten some really, really great ones. I have one here from, let's see, we've got one here from Alyssa. It says, much of the general public believes that myths surrounding thinning, especially the government. How can I provide evidence and shift climate policy to reflect the science? And 2, does the genus and species of the tree affect CO2 absorption at all? I think we kind of hit the first one by responding to letters to the editor, doing a big push, and contacting your representatives. So I'll pass it maybe to that second question about
yeah, that's true. And the only other thing I'll say about the first part of the question is we also have, John Muir Project has also compiled fact sheets with scientific citations that that MC and Jen can get to you all. If people are interested in that kind of background material, we can certainly get you as much as you could possibly ever want. So you have the scientific citations about the impacts on logging, including thinning on wildfire. With regard to the second part, sorry, MC, what was the second part of the question again?
The second part was, oh, hold on, I lost my place. Here we go. Does the genus and species of the tree affect CO2 absorption at all?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain tree species that do tend to grow faster than others. But it's not really a hardwood versus softwood issue so much. It's just more about the species. But the main thing, like sugar pines in California, they tend to grow faster than ponderosa pines. It's the fastest growing pine species in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Giant sequoias grow, fast. And certainly the same thing is true in eastern forests as well. There are certain species that tend to grow a little faster than others. The main thing, however, that is true is that larger trees absorb and store carbon more rapidly than smaller trees. That's the really key thing. And this is why the proforestation concept is so important. That we know that even as trees get old and large, they still continue to sequester and store a lot of carbon. I think a lot of people think that as trees get big and old, they stop absorbing carbon, they stop sequestering carbon. That's actually not true. Their rings get very small, but only because the tree's so big. And so if you think about it in 3 dimensions, the diameter and also the height of the tree, those tiny little narrow rings add up to a lot of carbon accumulation per year.
Awesome. All right, I have a question here. Go ahead, Jen.
Okay. Lauren has a question. Are you considering any type of silviculture management as logging, or would you consider logging to be tree removal in which trees are cut for profit and or wood products?
Yeah, I mean, good question. It's a terminology thing. Generally, when I say logging, I'm talking about removal of trees or portions of trees for lumber, for biomass, for other commodities. However, I will say that in some areas, and this is not the typical situation, but in some areas around the country, I've seen circumstances where most trees are cut down and oftentimes just piled on site for various reasons, based usually on misconceptions about the science. And a product is not being removed, but oftentimes it has the same effect. So I guess I would just say that when we're talking about, mostly when I say logging, that's what I'm talking about, but also I'm just talking about forest management in terms of tree felling, tree removal. That's really what we need to move away from. We need to keep the carbon in our forests. Now, again, if there's like a dead tree that's unstable and is leaning over a campground, you want to cut that down just for public safety. If it's about to fall on a power line, you want to cut that down for public safety. If it could fall down on your house, you want to cut that down for safety. But once it's on the ground, it's not a hazard anymore. And what I recommend as an ecologist, especially an ecologist concerned about climate change, is leaving that down log on the ground after it's felled, because it's great for wildlife habitat and it's great for carbon storage, and it replenishes the soil as it decays.
I think kind of to continue on that spectrum, Philip is wondering, if logging is so harmful to our environment, then what is the recommendation for obtaining and or growing lumber for our dwellings? Yeah,
great question. So I think that there's a few things that I would say in response to that question. It's a really important question. I appreciate it. I think that we need to do 3 key things. Okay. We need to start moving away from wood consumption. We need to reduce our wood consumption. There's no question about that. From a biodiversity standpoint, from a climate change mitigation standpoint, we have to do that. And that's what the letter from over 200 climate scientists and ecologists to Congress said last year, that we need to start making that shift. Now, how do we do that? Well, number one is just reduced consumption. So, I tell folks that, it's common these days for people to build, houses that are, quite large compared to how big they were in not so many decades ago, just in the mid 20th century, even in the 1960s and 1970s. My wife grew up in a house that was just over 1,000 square feet, family of 4. It's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. I've been in it many times. It doesn't feel small at all. It's laid out in a very intelligent way. We don't need to build 3,000, 4,000 square foot homes for the average size American family. But there has been a trend towards that over the last 25, 30 years in particular. So we don't have to do that. I think we need to reverse that trend. I think we need to do more with less. So that alone will be huge in terms of reducing our wood consumption. In addition, I would say we can and must do more with recycling of wood. I mean, there's very little recycling that happens in any meaningful way with wood products, and it's very recyclable material. The reason we don't recycle wood very much is because the logging industry is so heavily subsidized that it's really just very profitable for them to keep cutting down more forests, because at the state and federal level we keep subsidizing them. We need to stop those subsidies. And the last thing I would say is there's lots of tree-free alternatives for paper. You don't need to cut down forests for paper. There's lots of alternatives. There's also great alternatives for housing construction. In fact, now, because industrial hemp is now legal as of 2019, I believe, in the US, only very recently have some hemp producers been producing structural load-bearing hemp blocks. There's a company called Hemp Block USA, and Hemp Block USA produces interlocking structural load-bearing hempcrete blocks for housing construction. And you don't even need mortar. It's amazing. It's actually carbon negative, unlike logging, which is incredibly carbon intensive, has a huge carbon footprint. This actually absorbs carbon, and it's cheaper than wood. The problem is it's competing against all these logging subsidies that we need to get rid of.
Awesome. So we are at the top of the hour. We have till 8:30. So I've picked 5 more questions, and I think we should probably wrap up just then. And again, for everybody who's in the chat, who submitted a question, thank you, thank you, thank you. And just reiterating that we will send them all our answers and responses back through our follow-up materials. So I'll start with this one here from Ken. He said, we have seen arguments that we can't maximize both resiliency and carbon storage, and that we have to reach a compromise on each to achieve an optimal point. What is your take on this?
Great question. So forests with higher carbon storage levels tend to be more resilient to climate change. And for some of the reasons I talked about during my presentation, one of the things that happens as a forest matures, as it's allowed to mature and accumulate more carbon, if it's protected from logging, is that that forest develops a higher canopy cover and more of a wind buffer. And so in a sense, it develops a microclimate that sort of insulates it to some extent from extreme weather driven by climate and climate change. And so the idea that removing trees from forests makes them more resilient to climate change is not supported by the most current science and the best available science, because what it's telling us is that it's not only is that removing a lot of carbon from the forest and making climate change worse, but it's often making the forest more vulnerable and more exposed to extreme weather.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is from Cassidy. She says, the USDA Forest Service is a source of logging harvest on a mass scale. It is said that the money produced from the logging economy is used to protect public lands and regenerate our forest. So where is the middle ground between the government needing the logging money and sustainable and safe harvesting?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think the answer is the government doesn't need the logging money, that we need to ensure that the US Forest Service and other federal agencies have sufficient funds every year to operate from congressional appropriations. And myself and many other scientists, climate scientists, and ecologists across the country are increasingly of the view that we need to get the US Forest Service out of the commercial logging business and protect our public lands, both at the state and federal level. The problem is that when the Forest Service, because the US Forest Service is in the commercial logging business, in other words, they sell public trees to private logging companies and keep the revenue, like a giant logging corporation. because they're in the commercial logging business, they're financially incentivized to promote logging, to find justifications to promote logging. There's no way the public or policymakers can trust the US Forest Service when they're telling you that they need to log and remove trees for some reason, because we know that they're financially interested. We can't be in that position, and certainly not anymore, not here in 2021 or moving further, into the future as we get into the thick of the climate crisis here. At this moment in time when we have to turn the corner on the climate crisis, especially over the next 10 or 15 years. And this is our moment, and we just can't afford to have an agency with so much land, so much forest land, incentivized to remove trees and put most of that carbon in the atmosphere.
That's a great response, Chad. Thank you. All right, we've got another question here from Bart. He says, can you please explain the difference between natural climate solution, or between the terms natural climate solutions and nature-based climate solutions? And then he says, I have a hypothesis based on those who use the term nature-based. So the difference between natural climate solution and nature-based climate solutions.
So I think it's really funny you asked this question. I'm glad you asked it. I was just having this debate with two colleagues of mine, both of them PhD scientists, one a climate scientist, one an ecologist who's also a climate scientist. And one of them was saying you have to use the term natural climate solutions because the term nature-based climate solutions has been used by some pro-logging interests to sort of greenwash things and promote logging under this deceptive notion that somehow we'll store the carbon in wood products. And I've seen some articles by logging industry funded scientists that actually do use that term in a greenwashing sense. And the other colleague of mine said, oh, no, you have to use the term, you can't use the term nature-based climate solutions. I'm sorry, you can't use the term natural climate solutions. You have to use nature-based climate solutions because the term natural climate solutions has been abused by some logging interests. And so I've sort of thrown up my hands on that one recently, and I'm not really sure which term to use. I was using nature-based climate solutions, and then I switched to natural climate solutions. I have to say I like natural climate solutions better, but I've seen both terms misused. And I guess for me, the lesson is this: it's not about the term; it's about how it's used or misused. That I would just caution about. Just be on the lookout for if anyone's saying natural climate solutions or nature-based climate solutions, and what they're proposing is removing trees from forests. They're actually promoting something that's going to make climate change worse, and they're not promoting climate solutions.
Yeah, Bart, I would echo Dr. Hanson there and just always ask people to clarify what they mean when they use these nebulous terms. Yeah. Following up with that, on another question about language, Bob asks, can you describe your term hog fuel? He said he just looked it up, but he had never heard of it before.
Yeah. So, there's a number of different terms. It's a very colloquial term. There's a number of different terms for this, but basically what I mean when I say hog fuel is it's a term for the mill residue. When a log comes to the lumber mill, and then it goes to all the saw blades that take off the round parts and the bark on the sides, and then all the thick saw blades go through the middle and cut it. You lose a lot of the carbon in that a lot of the wood in that process. It ends up on the floor as sawdust and as wood chips and bark and these round pieces on the ends. So what basically it's not dimensional lumber, right? And that could be like half of the carbon in a log that comes to the lumber mill. And so what lumber mills will often do is they will burn that at the lumber mill to produce energy. It basically, a lot of the lumber mills are also forest biomass incineration facilities as well. And so they're burning wood in basically like a substitute for coal in a way, except it's even worse than coal from a climate change standpoint. And a lot of them call that hog fuel, that source of energy. And I guess my point is that it's another reason why most of the carbon in the trees that are removed from forests end up in the atmosphere very, very rapidly. And it's a reason why logging has such a high carbon footprint, and why we really need to protect our forests so they can absorb more carbon. A lot of people don't realize that basically in the 21st century, logging is mostly about dirty fuel. It's mostly about dirty climate polluting fuel than anything else. Very little of the carbon in a tree that's removed from the forest ends up in a lumber product somewhere.
Awesome. I think we actually have time to squeeze in 2 more questions, so I'm going to quick do that. We have one from Courtney. She says, do wildfire emissions released include the loss and sequestration are of the trees currently present? Loss of nutrient erosion, potential lapse of carbon sequestration over time from first killed trees, regrowth occurs.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, so basically the data that I'm presenting here, the studies that I'm talking about, they looked at a few things. You have to look at the initial emissions of carbon from the fire itself, from the combustion of the twigs and leaves and needles on the forest floor, the very small amount of combustion of the trees themselves, which, as I said, it's a tiny, but there is some, and you have to look at that. You also have to look at the fact that in certain areas where the fire burns more intensely, which, as I mentioned, even in a big fire, it's a minor portion of the area. Mostly they burn at low and moderate intensity. And so there really isn't much of an interruption in carbon sequestration because it's still most of the mature trees survive. But there are those high intensity fire patches where the fire kills most or all the trees. And in those places, of course, you are going to have an interruption for a certain number of years in the carbon sequestration because you don't have the big mature trees, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere because they're fire killed. Now you have a snag forest. And snag forest is incredibly important ecologically. Those standing dead trees are really important habitat. The down logs are really important habitat, whether it's the New Jersey pinelands or the upland forests in northeastern New Jersey. Northwestern New Jersey. It's whether you're talking about the Southwest or the Northeast, it's really important habitat. But if trees die in patches, there is a temporary interruption in carbon sequestration. However, it's very temporary because once the trees die, new growth comes in the understory, especially after fire, and that accelerates and sort of the curve steepens every year post-fire, and you get more and more rapid carbon sequestration. So for that reason, it recoups the carbon that was initially emitted in the fire very, very quickly, and then it often passes that, and you end up with more carbon in the forest than you had before the fire.
Awesome. All right.
And so, can I jump in? Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Neil has a question. He said the Sparta Mountain logging is being done for the stated purpose of diversifying the forest age, since it is all regrown from the early part of the 20th century. What is the validity of this reasoning?
It's not valid. Thank you for the question. This is one of the questions I was hoping to get in the Q&A. I didn't have enough time to address this in my main presentation, but thank you for asking it. So as you saw in the pictures of the logging being done on Sparta Mountain, on public lands, what you have are stumps and bare ground, essentially, and some slash debris. That does not in any way, shape, or form mimic natural ecological disturbances. So natural disturbances that create patches of dead trees, it can be from fire, it can be from wind, it can be from drought, it can be from a number of different factors. It can be from floods in some cases. And in certain different forest types, you're going to have a different mix of those natural disturbances. So in southeastern New Jersey, in the pinelands, of course, it's going to be a little bit more from fire historically. In northwestern New Jersey, in the more upland deciduous forests, mostly deciduous forests, you have relatively less fire disturbance naturally, much less frequent fire, and you're going to have natural disturbances that were from other factors typically. But the common denominator is any natural disturbance process that kills trees, whether it blows them over or snaps off the top half from wind or whatever, creates what is called complex early seral forest, what I call snag forest habitat. And snag forest habitat is defined by standing dead trees or portions of standing dead trees, down logs, and all of the rich native understory vegetation that grows in with the additional sunlight after whatever natural process killed the overstory trees. You do not have any of that in a logged area where you just have stumps and bare ground. You don't have the down logs, you don't have the snags. You've damaged the soil, and so you don't have a lot of the native understory vegetation that would otherwise grow in. You don't have the carbon because that's in the atmosphere mostly, and you simply don't have the habitat features that natural disturbance processes have been creating these forests for countless millennia. And the reason this is important is there's a lot of native species in the forest that need dead trees and down logs. Dead trees are really essential for woodpeckers, for a lot of native insects that need dead wood. The woodpeckers feed on the larvae of those native insects. They excavate nest cavities in dead trees because dead trees are softer than live trees, and they have more food for a lot of species. And then, of course, down logs are great habitat for invertebrates, for small mammals, for amphibians, for reptiles. So this is really, really important habitat. In fact, dead tree snags, which are standing dead trees, and down logs are even more important than live trees, ton for ton, in the forest ecosystem for biodiversity. Now, that's not to say live trees aren't important. They're very important for a lot of different species. But many species in the forest are more associated with dead trees, including down logs and snags. So all you do with logging is undermine that. And anyone who's telling you that logging is going to restore the natural mix of age classes is really just being dishonest with you from an ecological standpoint, because when they're logging a mature forest, they're not creating snag forest habitat like nature's been doing for countless millennia. They're not creating complex early sterile forest habitat, which has high carbon storage and high biodiversity. Instead, they're creating a stump field and making climate change worse in the process.
I was going to end with this question, but because of one of your comments, I think I should ask it, and I just found it funny. Craig wants to know, how did nature survive for 4.5 billion years without our management?
Great question. Look, I mean, this is I mean, you're speaking my language here, right? I mean, this is the point I've been making, that fire and other natural processes, but fire in particular, goes back 350 million years in our forests of this planet. The plants and animals in our forests have evolved over millions and millions of years in adaptation with natural disturbance processes, wind, floods, fire, drought, native insects, cycles of tree mortality and regrowth and rebirth and rejuvenation. We don't mimic any of that with logging. And these ecosystems don't need our intervention. They don't depend on our intervention. And I guess, your question gets at that point, how are they surviving for countless millions of years with all these natural disturbance processes long before, not just long before colonization, but long before any humans ever walked the earth on this planet. So these processes far predate human beings ecologically.
Okay, Matt has kind of a long question that I'm gonna, I know we only have a few minutes and there's two more that I would hope to get to, but let me try and dissect this one. Matt's having trouble reconciling this with the number of counter themes coming from a few areas and against so much relative new conventional wisdom. He's glad that you mentioned controlled burning, sustainable biomass. If done properly, like only dead, dying, or overcrowded trees, sawdust, carefully thinning systems, closed loop approaches, serious replanting. Sorry, Matt, I don't know if I see your question.
I think you get the picture. I mean, I would say that I think that the term sustainable biomass is not a term I would use. I think that most people would be misled by that. Whether you're talking about a dead tree or a live tree, the carbon that you would put into the atmosphere if you burn that tree for energy is the same. So we really can't afford to burn our trees live or dead, standing or fallen for bioenergy. It's a really dangerous thing for us to engage in from a climate change standpoint. And again, it's not curbing fires, removing those trees from the forest. But your deeper question, I think, is really interesting, and I want to respond to it because what you're really speaking to is this sort of drumbeat, a narrative that we're getting from the Forest Service, from certain state agencies, from some well-meaning but misled NGOs, and from a number of university scientists who seem to be speaking in accordance with the science, but are not revealing the fact that they're funded by the U.S. Forest Service or logging industry trade associations, often to the tune of $100,000, $200,000 a year. That's the issue that I really am speaking to, is that the voices out there in the scientific community who are promoting logging are almost invariably funded by the logging industry in one form or another, either through the U.S. Forest Service, which is part of the logging industry, or through logging industry trade associations or some other logging affiliated entity. And a far larger group of scientists are independent scientists, forest ecologists, climate scientists, ecologists of various types, and myself included. And we are saying something very, very different. The problem is there's a lot of money in logging, and there's a lot of money at stake. And they're devoting a lot of that money to public messaging, to media, to promote these false narratives. And people are hearing this. Reporters are hearing this. Politicians are hearing this. NGOs are hearing this. And they're hearing it all the time. These false narratives that our forests are overgrown. If we remove more trees, that'll curb fire. That'll make them more climate resilient. It'll keep more carbon in our forests. These are deceptions. These are lies. These are things that will make climate change worse. And these are voices that are basically affiliated with the logging industry, and we need to be careful about that.
David's wondering, do you think the logging industry can become more environmentally helpful?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I think that there's a partial yes answer on that. It's not about the type of logging so much. I mean, clear cutting is obviously a really, really bad idea. But it's not to say that, thinning doesn't do a lot of harm. It does. People hear the term thinning and they think pruning shears, but thinning is not pruning shears. Thinning is commercial logging. The typical thinning project kills and removes upwards of 60 or 70% of the trees in a given stand, including many of the mature trees and old trees. So thinning is not what people think it is. But what I will say is this: I have supported, and many of my colleagues support, subsidies, redirecting current logging subsidies that promote logging, and instead redirecting those to pay forest landowners who are in the logging business to basically substantially reduce their logging levels. My first priority, of course, is protect the existing public lands that we have, state and federal. Get the state and federal agencies out of the logging business. Protect those lands and keep the carbon in the forest. Second priority is allocating public resources into forest land acquisition of private forest lands from willing sellers and acquire it into protected state and federal ownership again, as part of a pro-forestation strategy. But my third priority is for forest landowners that do not want to sell, that want to stay in the logging business in one form or another, but are willing to change, subsidize them to log half as much as they have, 1/3 as much as they have, to dramatically reduce their logging levels. They can still stay in the business, but they can reduce logging, and I'm perfectly happy to pay them to do that. I think we need to as a society.
And we have a few minutes left. I'm hoping we can end on this question. Rebecca's wondering, Dr. Hanson, do you have any advice for wary conservationists who are trying to change hardened mines and address a county-wide thinning project that is supported by NGOs?
Yeah, just work with other NGOs, work with your friends at New Jersey Forest Watch, work with us, reach out to Jen and to MC, Marie Claire at John Muir Project. We can provide information and support. We can provide technical information. We can provide some tips about how to communicate the technical information to people who are making decisions. And, enlist the help of like-minded people, organize, because really that's what we need to do. We need to embrace grassroots organizing to advance the science and to advance climate solutions and to protect biodiversity. That's really what it's going to come down to. So I would say just recognize that there's a lot of really good people, well-meaning people in environmental NGOs that have been misled by these logging industry messages. And they've been misled by scientists who they do not realize are being funded by essentially the logging industry. And so I would say, just have compassion, have empathy, have understanding that everyone goes through this process of understanding and assimilating the information. at different rates and on their own timeline. But just try to bring people along if you can. If people are just steadfastly committed to promoting logging, well then do your best to out organize them, and get the message out that really what the scientific community is saying, those that are not funded by the logging industry or logging interests, is that we need to keep the carbon in our forests just like we need to keep it in the ground. And we need to start shifting away from wood consumption and reduce our wood consumption. We need to start that process now. And that means we're going to have a very serious conversation about increasing protection for our forests and holding politicians accountable, Democrats and Republicans, when the state and federal, when they do the wrong thing with regard to logging.
Thank you, Chad. That was awesome. And I think such a great question and a good note to end on for everybody. It is 8:30, so that is the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much for everybody who came. We had an amazing attendance and we had a lot of people stick around to the very, very end. So this was really great. I'm so excited. And like we said one more time, all the questions that we didn't get to that were in the chat, we're going to save and download, and we're going to do our best to do a written response to those questions in our follow-up materials. You will also get a copy of the webinar, a link for Chad's book, our newest report, Running Backwards. And I think that is everything. So with that, I want to say thank you and good night to everybody here on the East Coast. And Chad, I hope you get to have a good dinner.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the great questions, and big thanks to New Jersey Forest Watch and also to Jen and MC. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks for all the great attendance and really thoughtful conversation. Appreciate it.
Awesome. All right, everybody, have a good night. And thank you to our friends at New Jersey Forest Watch. We couldn't have done it without you. Bye-bye, everybody.